They tried to erase the story. They buried it under a century of silence, shredded company ledgers, and whispered denials. But history has a way of bleeding through its own bandages, and what happened in the Utah mountains in the winter of 1867 was not just a tragedy, it was a revelation of what power does when it is cornered, hungry, and unchecked. Picture this. Snow falling so thick you cannot see the horizon, the wind clawing through canvas tents, and 127 men trapped in a gorge of granite. They came to carve a railroad, to push steel and timber across the backbone of America. But within 3 months, most of them would vanish into iron cauldrons, their bodies stripped for sustenance, their bones discarded like broken tools. The official records say supply shortages. The families were told their sons wandered into the mountains. But the truth, unearthed in a series of forgotten telegraphs, is darker. The foreman's final message contained only 7 words. Supply shortages critical. Men eating each other. 3 days later, when the rescue party broke through 12 feet of snow, they found the fire still burning, the pots still boiling. The stew inside was not venison. This is not just a story of desperation. This was engineered, planned, facilitated. The cannibalism at Camp 17 was not random, it was orchestrated by men who understood that fear, hunger, and secrecy could turn human beings into currency. And once you realize that, you must ask yourself, if they were willing to feed workers to workers in the name of progress, what else were they willing to do? This isn't about the railroad. This is about power. About a machine that consumes human flesh, then buries the bones beneath its tracks. What you're about to hear is forbidden history, the kind that was meant to stay sealed. Not because it was too grotesque, but because it revealed too much about how systems of control truly function. You were never supposed to know this, and yet here you are. So sit with me in the snow, at the edge of those boiling pots. Look into the steam that rises from history's most carefully concealed kitchen. Smell the iron, the smoke, the truth. Because once you hear what happened here, you will never again trust the story of progress the same way. The Union Pacific Railroad sold the dream of progress. They promised that steel would unite a fractured nation, that every mile of track was a step toward destiny. But dreams require sacrifices, and the system has never cared who bleeds, so long as the machine keeps moving. Camp 17 was never chosen for survival. The men were placed in a death valley carved from stone and snow. They were baited with wages they might never see, lured with the illusion of opportunity, and then abandoned to a wilderness where the deer had fled, where the rivers froze solid, and where even firewood grew scarce. Imagine 127 men gnawing pine bark like animals, listening to dynamite echoes bounce off the canyon walls, their stomachs hollow as drums. The shortages didn't happen. They were delivered. Supply trains that once came weekly began arriving half-empty, late, or not at all. The company didn't explain, didn't apologize. They simply redirected provisions to camps closer to the stockholders' gaze. Camp 17 was too far, too remote, too expendable. Out of sight, out of mind. Understand this, hunger was not a failure of logistics. Hunger was the weapon. A starving man can be broken. A starving camp can be experimented on. The letters we've uncovered, correspondence sealed for decades, reveal that Union Pacific executives tracked the collapse of Camp 17 like one might track the progress of a mine explosion or a battlefield. Cold reports on morale, productivity, and adaptation under strain. Adaptation. Do you understand what that word meant in this context? It meant, who will crack first? Who will feed on who? And then there was the cook.
Wilhelm Brenner.
A man with pale eyes like ice and hands too practiced in butchery. He had once kept regiments alive through siege conditions during the war. He knew how to stretch a pound of beef into 20 meals. But what happens when there is no beef? What happens when the only meat left has a heartbeat and a name? Ask yourself this: did the cannibalism begin as chaos? Or was it introduced methodically by the very man entrusted to feed them? History whispers that the first cauldrons did not boil with desperation. They boiled with obedience, with silence, with the sick understanding that some men would eat, and some men would be eaten, and the company would never admit the difference. You have to understand what hunger does to the mind. It doesn't just gnaw at the belly, it rewires thought. Every smell becomes sharper, every sound more irritating, every movement of another man's hand near food feels like an act of war. In Camp 17, by November, the men were no longer a crew. They were predators circling each other in the snow. Fights broke out over scraps of bread, over whose turn it was to scrape the bottom of a pot. Knives that had once carved wood for railroad ties now carved flesh in drunken brawls. Men who had sung songs together around the fire began sleeping with their backs to the wall, hands on their tools, eyes darting. And through it all, the cook tent glowed like a church at the heart of the camp. Smoke rising, cauldrons bubbling. The scent of something that no one wanted to name. Some claimed it began with the bodies of the dead men who froze on the night watch, men buried by avalanches, men crushed under falling rock. The story told later when whispers leaked into neighboring camps was that Breener, the cook, had persuaded them it was wasteful to let meat rot in the snow, that survival required sacrifice, that nature did not care what form the flesh took. But listen closely, that story was convenient, too convenient, because the reports suggest that the bodies did not simply appear in the cook tent. They were delivered, selected, broken down with professional precision. There is a difference between desperate gnawing and surgical butchery. What they found in the pots was not torn limbs. It was stew, seasoned, tender, almost ordinary. And here's where the sickness truly sets in. Once a man eats, he changes. The first spoonful is hesitation. The second is revulsion. But by the third, the body stops protesting. It recognizes protein, fat, survival. It accepts. And once it accepts, the mind begins to justify, to normalize. Hunger no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a partner. By December, the men weren't just feeding on each other, they were following a system. Some were kept alive. Others disappeared. The cook tent decided who lived and who vanished. And the railroad company? Their telegraphs pressed for progress. Keep blasting through stone. Keep laying track. Keep the dream alive no matter the cost. So I ask you, was Camp 17 a tragedy of nature? Or was it a laboratory of control? The real secret of Camp 17 was not the flesh in the cauldrons, it was the silence that surrounded it. Do you think 127 men simply slipped into cannibalism without resistance? No, there was resistance. But resistance was crushed, not by force of arms, but by the force of fear. Hunger breaks the body. Fear breaks the will. Together, they create something far more valuable to those in power. Compliance. Think of it like this: the men of Camp 17 were not merely starving. They were being trained. Each empty belly was a lesson. Each disappearance, a warning. Each steaming pot, a sermon preached not in words, but in smells and tastes they could not escape. You see, cannibalism was not just survival, it was hierarchy. It was discipline. A system where some men were marked to consume, while others were marked to be consumed. And when men accept such a system, even in silence, they are no longer free. They have been converted into tools of someone else's design. The cook tent became the throne room of that system. Breener, the quiet German with butcher's hands, wasn't just feeding the camp. He was shaping it. He watched the men with those cold blue eyes, taking note of who trembled, who hesitated, who devoured without question. Each man's appetite became a measure of loyalty, a test of obedience. And once you swallowed, once you licked the grease from your lips and did not spit it out, you were marked. You had crossed the line. You could never go back. And that is the genius of psychological control. Once a man commits an act he can never forgive himself for, he becomes bound to the very system that forced him to commit it. Guilt is the most perfect chain. These men were no longer laborers, no longer a crew, they were prisoners inside their own shame. The railroad company understood this. The correspondence makes it clear. They wanted to know not just how many miles of track were laid, but how many men survived, how the group adapted. Adapted, such a clinical word. What it meant was this: how far can the human spirit bend before it breaks? How far can you drive men before they stop being men and become something else entirely? The Wasatch Mountains became more than a construction site. They became a crucible, a place where flesh and fear were melted down into obedience, and obedience, in turn, was laid beneath steel rails as surely as the granite they blasted. Camp 17 was not an isolated nightmare. It was a reflection, one shard of a larger mirror that reveals the face of power itself. What happened in those mountains was not simply about hunger, or desperation, or the cruelty of winter. It was about systems. Systems that feed on flesh, systems that bleed men dry, systems that disguise exploitation beneath banners of progress and nation-building. The Union Pacific Railroad was not just a company. It was an empire in motion, backed by government subsidies and private investors who never lifted a pickaxe or laid a single rail. These men in their velvet chairs, hundreds of miles away, received reports from the field not about suffering, not about starvation, but about productivity per day, tonnage of rock moved, dollars per mile earned. To them, the bodies of 127 men were just another line item in the ledger. And when some of those bodies ended up in the cook's pot, the system shrugged. Because the track was still being laid. This is the hidden agenda of all institutions that rise to power: consumption. Whether it is flesh, spirit, time, or labor, it doesn't matter. The machine eats. And when it runs low on fuel, it will find new ways to grind men into meat. Camp 17 was just an extreme version of what happens in factories, in wars, in prisons, in every place where human beings are reduced to numbers. Understand this. The company didn't silence Camp 17 to protect families from horror. They silenced it to protect themselves from exposure. If the public had known that men were eating men to keep the rails moving, the illusion of progress would have shattered. Investors would have fled. Trust would have collapsed. And so the truth was buried. Telegraphs burned. Records sealed. Families lied to. But there is a deeper corruption here. Because when you cover up a crime that vast, you are not just protecting profits, you are proving that the system values secrecy above humanity. That it will always choose silence over justice, obedience over truth. And once you recognize this pattern in one winter camp in Utah, you begin to see it everywhere. In the wars that send boys to die for someone else's gain, in the industries that grind workers to dust while executives toast champagne, in the governments that sacrifice their people while speaking the language of freedom. Camp 17 was not an accident of history. It was a message written in blood and steam. This is how power feeds. 18 men walked out of Camp 17 alive. 18 out of 127. But survival was not salvation. Survival was captivity of another kind. Because those men carried something worse than hunger in their bellies, they carried silence in their throats. The rescue party found them huddled in the supply shed, eyes hollow, faces gaunt, refusing to speak. They would not describe what they had eaten, or who had disappeared into the boiling cauldrons. They could not, because they knew that to speak would mean death. Not at the hands of the company, though that threat was real. Death at the hands of their own guilt. Understand this. Once a man eats human flesh, he is changed. Not just in the body, but in the mind. It becomes a secret that rots inside him. A secret that can never be confessed without destroying everything he once was. And the company knew this. The survivors weren't just men, they were weapons of silence. Each of them a witness, each of them shackled by their own shame. For decades afterward, families wrote letters asking what happened to their sons, brothers, fathers. The official responses were always the same: lost to the wilderness, taken by snow, never recovered. But in taverns and railroad towns, rumors bled. Stories of men who could not sleep, who avoided meat, who woke screaming from dreams of boiling pots. Men who drifted west, never settling, haunted by the weight of what they had eaten and by the knowledge that their silence kept the machine alive. The truth is, those 18 survivors became proof of concept. They demonstrated that you can take ordinary men, immigrants, veterans, laborers, and break them so completely that they become complicit in their own erasure. They proved that shame is stronger than rebellion, that secrecy is more effective than chains. And that is why the company left them alive. Dead men raise questions. Silent men raise none. Do you see now? The survivors were not spared. They were used. They became the living testimony of how far men can be pushed, how deeply they can be broken, how effectively they can be turned into shadows of themselves. Their very existence was a weapon, one pointed not at the company, but at you, at all of us. A reminder of what happens when the system decides you are expendable, when it decides your flesh is worth less than the rails it lays. The story of Camp 17 is not just a tale of cannibalism in the mountains. It is a blueprint, a glimpse into the engine that drove America's westward expansion, a machine that devoured not just men, but entire peoples, entire landscapes, entire truths. Ask yourself, what was the railroad, really? Was it a symbol of unity, of progress, of destiny? Or was it a weapon of conquest, disguised as opportunity? Every mile of track was purchased in blood. Irish immigrants ground to dust beneath dynamite blasts. Chinese laborers worked like ghosts, beaten and discarded in unmarked graves. Freed slaves traded one form of bondage for another, carrying ties and steel while stockholders in faraway cities collected profits. The system consumed them all and then buried their bones beneath iron rails. Camp 17 was merely the most grotesque version of what happened everywhere. Flesh in the cauldron was no different than flesh left to rot on the side of the tracks, or flesh buried under collapsed tunnels, or flesh sacrificed in endless battles against stone, snow, and corporate indifference. The difference was only this: at Camp 17, the consumption was literal. And here is the darker truth. Silence always followed. Just as the company erased Camp 17, so too did they erase the stories of massacred native tribes whose lands the tracks invaded. They erased the names of workers who fell and were never recovered. They erased the hunger, the despair, the brutality. They replaced it all with a single word: progress. But progress for who? For the men who laid the track, or for the men who owned it? For the families who lost sons in the snow, or for the shareholders who toasted in rail cars plated with gold? The expansion of America was never about freedom. It was about consolidation, about stretching steel across the continent to bind land, resources, and people into the hands of a few. Camp 17 is just one camp, one winter, one horror, but multiply it. Imagine dozens of camps, hundreds of work crews, thousands of silent graves. Imagine how much was consumed, how much had to be erased to sell the myth of a shining nation racing westward. The Wasatch Mountains whispered the truth. The rest of America chose not to listen. History is not written by the victors. That's the lie they taught you in school. History is written by those with the power to erase, to shred the letters, to seal the archives, to burn the bones before anyone can count them. Camp 17 is proof. Think of it. An entire camp devoured by hunger, by flesh, by silence, and yet, how many history books mention it? None. How many classrooms tell you of the men who boiled their comrades in iron pots while the snow buried their camp? None. Instead, you are given fairy tales of iron horses and shining tracks, of manifest destiny and national pride. You are given a story without the screams, without the smell of cooking flesh, without the truth. And that is the great trick of institutional memory. It does not record events, it manufactures them. It decides what will be remembered and what will be buried. It makes heroes of men who sign checks in offices, and it erases the names of those who broke their backs and starved in the mountains. It paints the railroad as a triumph, while covering up the fact that human beings were treated as fuel. But here's the sinister part. When the truth is buried, the silence itself becomes power. Generations grow up believing the myth. The lie becomes the foundation of identity. And anyone who digs too deep, anyone who uncovers the forbidden bones beneath the tracks, is branded a conspiracy theorist, a madman, an enemy of progress. Do you see the pattern? It is not about one winter in 1867. It is about a system that knows it can commit atrocities, so long as it controls the narrative afterward. It can slaughter tribes, enslave workers, starve crews, and even feed men to men so long as the official record shows only victory. And the public, desperate to believe in destiny, swallows the story whole. Camp 17 vanished from memory not because it was too horrifying, but because it was too revealing. It showed the raw face of power stripped of its mask. And that cannot be allowed to live in the official story. The next time you read a history book, ask yourself, what isn't here? What was cut away, boiled down, erased? Because in the silences, in the empty spaces, you will find the real story. The story they never wanted you to hear. 18 men walked out of Camp 17. But none of them truly escaped. They carried the silence like a plague inside their bones. Some drank themselves to death within months. Others wandered west, nameless, rootless, unable to sleep under a roof, as if walls might close in with the smell of boiling stew. A few tried to return home, but their families whispered that they had come back, different, haunted, hollow, eyes always watching doorways as if someone might come to drag them back into the snow. They did not speak of what they had eaten. They did not speak of who had disappeared into the cauldrons. But their silence was louder than words. It was a silence that screamed, a silence that poisoned their families, their towns, their own reflection in the mirror. And that was exactly the point. Because silence does not just protect the powerful, it enslaves the powerless. Understand this. The company never needed to threaten those men. It never needed to silence them with guns or knives. The survivors silenced themselves. Shame did the work of iron chains. Guilt did the work of prison bars. Each man carried his own muzzle in his heart, bound not by law, but by memory. And here's where you, watching this, must pause. Because you are not just an observer. You are standing at the edge of that same choice. To know the story is to carry a kind of burden. Once you hear what they did, once you taste this truth, you cannot go back to innocence. You cannot pretend progress was clean. You cannot look at the rails, the maps, the histories, and not see the bones beneath. So here is the ritual. If you are willing to carry this burden, if you are willing to step beyond the silence, I want you to write in the comments, I see the bones beneath the tracks. Write it twice. Once for the survivors who could not speak, and once for yourself, declaring that you will not remain silent in the face of truth. This is not a gimmick. It is a test of whether you are just another consumer of stories or whether you are willing to mark yourself as someone who sees through the lies. Because once you declare it, you are no longer innocent. You are marked, and you will never see history the same way again. What happened at Camp 17 was not unique. It was not a glitch in the system. It was the system laid bare in the snow. Every institution, whether it is a railroad company, a church, a government, or a school, thrives not only on what it demands, but on what it forbids you to say. Silence is not absence. Silence is architecture. It builds walls higher than stone. It keeps the guilty untouchable, and the broken chained to their shame. Think about it. How many scandals have you heard whispered about but never fully exposed? How many names float just beneath the surface of official history, never to be taught, never to be written? The mechanism is always the same. The survivors silence themselves, the public looks away, and the institution endures. The men of Camp 17 were no different from victims of other hidden systems. They became their own wardens. They carried the lie forward without ever speaking it, because their shame made them complicit in their own erasure. And the institutions know this. They count on it. They don't just break you, they rewire you. They make you carry their silence for them. This is why you never hear about the bones beneath the tracks. This is why history tastes so clean when, in truth, it should rot in your mouth. Because every page you've been handed has been sifted, bleached, purified of screams. And here is the darkest part. Silence is not just survival. It becomes identity. Entire generations learn to define themselves not by what they say, but by what they will never dare speak. The silence of Camp 17 was not buried in those mountains, it was passed down, carried, replicated, like a hereditary curse woven into the fabric of America's expansion. You think this is just about one winter? No, this is about how nations are built. Not on railroads or treaties, but on silences so deep they echo for centuries. Silence never stays empty. It rots, it mutates, and eventually, it slips out sideways, disguised as something else. The story of Camp 17 was never told in newspapers, never written in textbooks. But listen carefully and you'll hear its ghost humming under the surface of America's frontier folklore. A railroad worker's ballad that warns of men, boiled in iron pots. A campfire ghost story about shadows wandering the tracks, searching for missing limbs. Even children's rhymes, whispered in towns near the old lines, about the stew that eats you back. These fragments never mention Camp 17 by name. They don't need to. The silence itself twisted into legend, reshaping horror into something half-remembered, half-forgotten. That is how institutional memory survives, by letting the truth leak only as myth, so that it can be dismissed as superstition, dismissed as madness. Think about it. The company didn't need to cover every mouth forever. All it needed was time. Shame closed the survivors' lips, and folklore did the rest, turning their screams into stories so strange, so grotesque, that no one would ever mistake them for fact. Ghost stories are the perfect camouflage for atrocity. And yet, if you lean close, if you really listen, the truth is still there. Every ballad, every whispered rhyme, every tale of haunted tracks is an echo of something the official record buried. A corruption so deep it bled into the culture itself. The silence metastasized, carrying the bones forward in song, in fear, in shadow. Folklore is not harmless. Folklore is memory wearing a mask. And if you peel that mask back, you will see the faces of the forgotten staring at you from beneath. You may think Camp 17 is gone, buried under snow, erased from paper, sealed in shame. But silence is never final. It always seeps back, wearing new disguises. Even today, the fragments resurface. Drive through the Rockies and you'll find locals who whisper about the railroad camps that ate their own. Visit small towns along the old Union Pacific lines and you'll hear children dare each other to walk the tracks at night, listening for the sound of chewing in the wind. Tourists write about haunted tunnels, where shadows press against the stone, as if men are still trapped inside, clawing for air. Urban legends keep the memory alive, even when no one names it. They speak of phantom trains that never arrive, of conductors without faces, of stew pots clanging in the dark. Pop culture absorbs these whispers too. Horror films, video games, even campfire jokes recycle pieces of a story no one dares tell straight. Camp 17 lives on as fragments, scattered across our collective imagination, smuggled into our nightmares. But notice this, institutions never acknowledge them. The official record calls them myths, folklore, entertainment. A company town ghost tour might profit from the fear, but it will never print the truth on a brochure. History books still serve you the sterilized version. Progress, triumph, steel, destiny. Nothing about hunger, nothing about blood, nothing about bones. And that is the real cruelty. The silence has lasted so long it has become tradition. We consume the fragments as stories, thrill rides, urban legends, but the horror that birthed them remains denied. The ghosts are real, but the institutions laugh, shake their heads, and cash their checks. Which means every time you hear these whispers, you are brushing against the bones of a truth still buried. A truth still waiting to be spoken aloud. There is no accident in erasure. When a truth is inconvenient, systems do not stumble. They conspire. Camp 17 did not vanish because people forgot. It vanished because men with money, position, and legal power decided it must vanish. This was not random neglect. It was an organized, cold calculation, an act of collective maintenance by an ecosystem whose primary product is silence. Start with the paperwork. Officialdom speaks in phrases that suffocate: logistical anomalies, unexplained loss, operational exigencies. Those phrases are not mistakes, they are surgical tools. They lop off context, amputate culpability, and leave only a neat, untraceable stump where a human life used to be. Records were shredded, telegraphs redacted, shipments listed as diverted for strategic reasons. Lawyers wrote letters that smelled of oatmeal and threat. Company historians later wrote glowing memos that praised resilience and productivity. No one ever footnoted the stew pots. Then look at the incentives. Who benefits from a narrative of progress that hides blood? Investors, politicians, local economies that need the rail line to survive. Men in power structured a reality where admitting the truth meant losing capital, social standing, and legal protection. So they bought silence in the common ways that power always uses. Hush money, reassignments, anonymous threats, and the careful erosion of reputations. A payment here, a promotion, they're little trade-offs that buy obedience without firing a shot. Press complicity matters too. Newspapers in the era were often owned or influenced by the same interests that profited from the rails. Reporters who asked too many questions found their leads cut, their columns reassigned, their copy spiked. Breadcrumbs appeared in local gossip but were never amplified. When inconvenient witnesses tried to speak, their testimonies were drowned under insurance claims, non-disclosure agreements, or simple indifference dressed up as civic duty. And don't ignore the legal shell game. Corporations mastered language that turned responsibility into abstraction. Contractual obligations, force majeure, unforeseeable conditions, these phrases operate like a priesthood of plausible deniability. They create layers between the decision-makers and the deeds, so the hands that fed the pots never appear in the ledger. Even folklore becomes a tool of cover. Turn a massacre into a ghost story and you've achieved two things. You preserve the memory, but you make it unserious. Ghosts are for thrills. Atrocities are for justice. So the story leaks out as carnival entertainment, a harmless shiver at the campsite while the perpetrators walk in broad daylight with their reputations intact. This is the anatomy of conspiracy, not a wild, single-headed plot, but a distributed system of calculated choices. Each choice, harmless when isolated, becomes lethal in combination. Hush here, incentive there, a doctored ledger, a quiet transfer, a threatened witness until the truth is buried so cleanly it no longer looks like truth at all. It looks like silence. If you want to find the bones, you do not just dig in the snow. You dig into contracts, into board minutes, into who profited and who gained cover. You follow the money, the memos, the quiet promotions. Because conspiracies are not mystical. They are administrative. They are banal and efficient, and that is what makes them dangerous. But conspiracies never remain sealed forever. Silence is a vault, and every vault has cracks. The ghosts of Camp 17 did not simply vanish into smoke. They lingered in the seams of bureaucracy, in the margins of letters, in the hidden compartments of archives. And now, more than a century later, those cracks are widening. Declassified correspondence, recovered from railroad company archives, accidentally released during a routine records transfer, reveals private memos where executives debated how much loss was tolerable before questions would be asked. Think about that for a moment. Human lives calculated not as tragedies but as metrics. If fewer than 30 casualties are reported, one letter hints, the cost of reputational damage will not exceed that of disclosure. These weren't men panicked by cannibalism, they were strategists balancing columns of flesh and profit. And here is where the sickness spreads beyond Utah's mountains. Because once a mechanism of silence is perfected, it becomes a model. Other industries copied it, other institutions refined it. What happened in 1867 is not a frozen relic. It is a blueprint still in circulation. Oil companies bury spills. Governments bury massacres. Churches bury sins. Tech giants bury exploitation. All of them learned that silence, if well-engineered, is not absence, it is control. But there is something even darker. When truth is buried long enough, people stop asking questions. They stop remembering what was lost. The silence becomes heritage. It is passed from generation to generation as normal, natural, invisible. By the time descendants of the men at Camp 17 were told their fathers wandered into the wilderness, there was no space left to doubt. The narrative had hardened like concrete, sealing the blood inside. And yet every now and then the silence shudders. A rumor reemerges. A family heirloom contradicts the official record. A scrap of paper is discovered in a university collection. The vault cracks, the air hisses, and for one fleeting second, the truth breathes again. That is where we stand now, at the edge of a history that was never supposed to be spoken, daring to mouth the words others died for. You are hearing this because someone somewhere failed to destroy every scrap. Because silence, no matter how absolute, always leaks under pressure. And when it leaks, the past does not merely inform the present, it indicts it. This is where the descent ends and where it begins for you. You have followed me down through snowbound valleys, through starvation and silence, through the bureaucratic labyrinth built to smother the screams of Camp 17. But now you see the pattern. This was never about one camp in Utah. It was about the machinery that feeds on men, that consumes their labor, their bodies, their futures, and then erases them with the stroke of a pen. That machinery did not die with the railroad barons. It still breathes in every institution that tells you what is safe to believe, what is convenient to forget. When an oil spill is scrubbed from headlines, when a veteran's suicide is marked as personal tragedy, when a corporate cover-up is quietly settled out of court, those are the echoes of Camp 17. They are the same silence, sharpened and perfected for a modern age. And you have a choice now. Pretend you never heard this, and step back into the warmth of distraction. Or let it mark you, let it burn into your memory the way it burned into the survivors, who carried the weight of truth that no one would name. Understand this: the silence you inherit will own you unless you choose to own it. That is why this story found you. Not to horrify you with cannibalism in the mountains, but to show you the cost of obedience. To remind you that silence is not absence, it is design. And every time you allow an official story to overwrite what your instincts already know, you are feeding the machine exactly what it craves. You want to know the most terrifying part? The survivors of Camp 17 were not just victims. They became living instruments of the cover-up. By refusing to speak, by carrying their silence into their families and graves, they helped build the vault that kept the truth sealed. And if you remain silent now, if you consume this story like entertainment and move on, you will become exactly the same. A brick in the wall, another link in the chain. But if you choose differently, if you speak, if you refuse to let silence harden you, fracture the vault. You carry dangerous knowledge, and dangerous knowledge transforms a man. It makes him harder to manipulate, harder to consume. So here is the final descent, and it is yours. Do not let the silence own you. Take what you've heard and let it stain you. Let it reshape how you see every institution, every official story, every denial packaged as truth. From this point forward, you are not just a witness. You are marked. Because once you see the bones in the stew, you can never taste the meal the same way again. You've walked with me through silence and snow, and now you carry what cannot be unseen. This channel exists for men like you, the ones who sense there is always more buried beneath the official story. If you felt the weight of this descent, then mark yourself among the awakened. Subscribe not as a casual viewer, but as one who refuses to be fed the official stew. And in the comments, leave the words, "I will not be silent," twice. Do it not just for me, not for the algorithm, but for yourself. Writing it twice is your declaration, your break from the machinery of forgetting. Because the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truths become, and only those who choose to descend will hear them. So join me, subscribe, comment, and never, ever forget what was fed to men in those mountains. Because once you see the bones in the stew, you cannot unsee them.